Okay, so you did not see me on Monday. Hopefully, everyone watched the videos that I posted on Canvas. One was over enums, one was over. I have to look because I can't remember. One was over enums, one was rock paper scissors game. Inheritance, that was your thing. Inheritance, enums, and that rock paper scissors game. Uh, Today, what I would like to do is I would like to spend the first portion of the day watching a three-part video series on making a calculator in Visual Studio, so incorporating like win forms and that sort of thing. Okay, and then I'd like to spend the second portion of the class, which is to say shortly before we take a break, deciding what we might like to do as a class project, okay, for the semester. We have several weeks remaining, so we have plenty of time to decide and get it done and so on and so forth. But it's definitely a conversation that we need to have. Then we'll go to break, we'll come back and we'll work on the calculator project, whatever you're unable to get done during the lecture, okay? Before we get started, and I don't want to talk for terribly long on this because we're going to discuss it here in a little bit, but does anyone have any ideas? Kyle proposed that perhaps we could take the game that he's making in Unity, and we could go with that, to propose a similar but alternative approach. We could also make what he's making in Godot. That's also possible since that uses C#. We could make something in Visual Studio. Now it needs to be a little more complex than like a calculator. It doesn't need to be, we don't need to go out and make World of Warcraft, but I mean, it needs to be more complex than just a simple visual calculator probably. Not much more complex. But any thoughts? Just is there any project, any small to medium-ish sized project that anybody in here thinks would be really fun to work on collaboratively as a class? If you don't have any thoughts now, that's fine. Just be thinking, and we can talk later. No? Okay, that's fine. Just be rolling that around in your head and thinking what sounds like a fun project. Now, bear in mind, while we do have quite a bit of semester remaining, we have about half, about 8 weeks or so remaining. And so it's really about closer to 9. But we have a lot of time and simultaneously very little. So we need to pick something, but also make sure that the thing we pick is not biting enough more than we can chew, right? Because there is no, trust me, as someone to whom this has happened several times, there is no worse feeling in this world than working your butt off on something and it just doesn't come together because you took on way too large of a project. I've had groups do that, and I've done that myself. So, all right. Well, without further ado, then let's hop over here and check out this first video. I mentioned this a moment ago before class began. I like this individual's approach. I think he is a little shy and probably needs to work on his presentation skills, but his knowledge base is really good, and his approach is really good. Would you all agree that the project-based approach that I'm working with is it's working for everybody? I mean, as opposed to just standing here and saying, let's take tests and talk about like what an if statement is and stuff like that. Like, it's better to actually apply it, see it in person, right? Would you all agree with that? Cool, awesome. Now that learning style doesn't work for everybody. So if at some point you're like, hey, could you do less of the videos and more of the just like I don't know, more of having us do something else, whatever. So the reason I'm saying that is in one of the classes that I'm taking this semester, I just got done reading an article about a high school science teacher that had their students take pictures in and around the school and in and around their homes of science. And they said, now what I was hoping is that when they explained the pictures and explained the science in them, that it would demonstrate what they know about science, right? And it did a little bit. But they said, now, first of all, they said everything fit into a couple of really broad categories. One was biology, so a lot of like pictures of houseplants and pets and things like that, or electronics like TVs and things. Like most pictures were like that. And then like one student, like for their picture of the flower, like when they asked, what is the science in this? The student responded with, well, it uses photosynthesis, but couldn't really demonstrate a broader knowledge than that. But what the instructor did learn was that when they discussed the pictures, that the reflection upon the pictures they had taken and the discussion by the class as a whole was really beneficial to students. They really got fired up and remembered things. They really took ownership of like their knowledge and things like that. And so the instructor incorporated more visuals into their teaching, right? So maybe not let's go out and take pictures all the time, but let's incorporate, like, draw me a graph, draw me a picture of, like, draw the water cycle for me or something like that sort of thing, okay? So I say all that to say, if there's something like that that would benefit you all, and I'm always on the lookout for that sort of stuff, but if there's some sort of learning method that you know you do really well with, please let me know, because I'm here to teach you to the best of my abilities in the way that works the best for you. So it's my little spiel for the day. Okay, so let's switch over and let's watch this video here.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another Codehaven video. Today we're going to be making a custom calculator app using Windows Visual Studio, and we're going to write it in C#. So let's just get it launched here. And make sure you have it up to date, because of course it can change over time. So we're going to create a new project, and you're going to want to scroll down and try to find where it says Windows Form with the .NET framework. So right here we got
Sorry, before we even get started, one thing, I meant to mention this before I started the video and I forgot. We're going to be using the .NET framework to make this. Now, as we progress in C#, not in this class probably, but in C# 2 when you take that, we or whomever is teaching that class will start talking about the .NET Core, okay? Now, the .NET framework is really old. Not really old, but I mean, compared for computer stuff, really old. And it was designed to sort of provide a universal Windows format, basically, of making apps and things like that. But as time has gone on, Microsoft realized, like, hold on a second, okay, so we're teaching these people to use the .NET framework, and we're teaching them to use Visual Studio and C# and all this stuff that really benefits people that are programming on Windows, but hold on a second, what if they're not programming on Windows? What if they're primarily programming on Windows, but whatever this particular application is, they want it to run on Mac OS as well. They want it to run on phones. They want it to run on an Xbox or a PlayStation or whatever, right? So they came up with the .NET Core. Now you may notice directly below, there on the left, it says Project Templates. It says Windows Forms App .NET Framework is the top one. That's the one he selected most recently. And the one directly below it is a Windows Forms App .NET Core. Now, we're using the .NET Framework because he's using the .NET Framework, and it's going to be confusing to you if we sit here and try to, like, tweak it and modify it slightly so it works. And especially because we're all running Windows on all these computers, our focus is Windows for the time being. So I just wanted to kind of go on a spiel about that and let you know that the future, and this is coming from Microsoft, there's a video that we watched in C# 2 where they literally say this exact thing. The future is .NET Core. There's no doubt about it. Like, .NET Framework will eventually kind of like go away and die off. Now, they'll always support it because there's a lot of a lot of applications that are in place that already exist that rely on specific libraries in the .NET Framework. So they'll always support it probably, or at least for the foreseeable future. But the .NET Core is the future of C# and of doing like Windows forms and that sort of thing. But for this particular example, we're using framework. So sorry, I just wanted to make sure that was clear. Also, in case you go out to try to do something on your own and you come across the .NET Core, you're not like, well, what is this? The professor didn't bring up what in the world's going on. So I want to make sure everybody knew.
That's actually Visual Basic, my bad. Yeah, so right here, we got Windows Forms app with the .NET framework, and it's written in C#. So we're going to do that. And let's just call it whatever. I'm going to call it Calculator app. Okay. And everything looks up to date. This is the most recent framework, and it doesn't really matter what the solution name is. You can store it wherever you want. I just use the default Visual Studio path. So yeah, let's create it. Alright guys, so right when you load in here, you're going to notice that we have a blank form and it's nice and empty for us. Microsoft made it really easy to visually display what you're doing and connect it to the code later. A lot of people like to write it, into the code. They like creating their buttons and labels, and there's nothing wrong with that. But for newer people and people who just like to see stuff visually, this is a really good way to do it. So one of the most important parts of this is actually going to be the toolbox. And if you open it up, you're going to see all these crazy things. There's like a million different options in here. But this is basically every single thing you could either visually add to the app, or it's some stuff's like in the background. So like I know there's like a timer, and you can drag and drop, and it's real nice and easy. But there's all kinds of stuff here. So we're actually going to need a lot of buttons, because of course it's a calculator, so we're gonna want to create, you know, equals button, plus button, all the numbers, you know how it is. So we're gonna need a button and a label. And you'll notice how you can't really resize it here. So one of the things that I always like to do when I drag stuff on here is there's a thing called auto size, and we're gonna want to turn that off. And that instantly lets you drag it as big as you want. So that's real nice. And don't double click it just like I did, because that will automatically add a void method to your code in the back end. And the thing is, if you remove this, see how it says one reference right here? If you happen to delete this because you're like, oh, oops, I made a mistake, I don't want that here. So if you delete this, you'll actually notice when you go back, this is broken. It hates this. So you want to undo it. Undo what you did. Go back. And the proper way to remove it, from what I've seen, is this little lightning symbol right here. This controls all the methods, and you can just delete this here. And then click enter, and that will remove it, or actually remove the reference. And then you can go here, because it says your references now. You can go back and delete that. Okay, so let's go back to the form, and let's continue to set up what we need here. So this says label in it, but just for our sake, let's just put a default value of like 1. And actually, let's do 0, because calculators don't start at 1. And another important thing is this name here under design. Most elements have this portion, and this is actually what it's going to be called when you connect it to the code. So let's just call it, calculator display, and let's do camel case on that, just for some organization's sake. Okay, and you can change all kinds of stuff like back color, and that's actually kind of important here. So let's make it black, and then let's make the text white. So white. Yeah, so you see how there's a nice 0.
And the place that he did that for the text is under the font section. So right here, we have appearance, he says font, and then for color. You would think it would be font color, but it's the foreground color, which is to say the font. Now, why in the world anyone would choose to name it that, I haven't the foggiest idea, but so you're not confused, it's right here, the first option under font, I'm sorry, the first option under font. I guess the first one is technically what font and what size. But anyway, just wanted to point that out to you in case anybody couldn't find it.
There in white, just like a normal calculator. And we're going to increase the font size here. So let's take this up to like, I don't know, 30? Yeah, that should be about it. Actually, we can bump it up just a little bit more, maybe 35. And yeah, let's just start with that. So we also need buttons. We're going to need a lot of them. And you can size them right now if you want. That's fine. That's up to you. You can keep dragging them like this. That's always nice. Or you can just copy and then just keep pasting new ones. And it'll increase it. So they are separate buttons. It's not exact copies. So let's just create the numpad first. So we're going to have it. We need 1, 2, 3. So 1, 2, 3. And this spacing is messed up. We'll come back to that later. But 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We're gonna need the equals button. So let's just make that a little bigger, I guess. Let's make it the size of 2. Sure. And we're gonna need a plus button and a minus button. And let's just drag all this downwards. Like I said, We can tinker with how it actually looks later, but for now we're going to just try to get everything on the board, and we can just tinker that later. So plus, minus, equals. We're going to need to multiply and divide. So here we go. And let's get one more in here. This is divide. So we got divide, multiply, plus, minus, equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Let's take this up a little bit. We're going to need a clear button. So let's add that. We'll just say that this is the clear button for now. We're going to need a 0. And we're going to need a decimal. So just like that. And I'm pretty sure this is how the majority of calculators look. All right, so we have a lot of buttons here. Let's move some stuff around. So let's say that's the 0, and this is clear. So I've seen a lot of calculators have a bigger clear button. So we'll call this 0, and let's start actually naming them so we can keep track of this. So this is the actual name of it, and we're gonna call this the clear, no, sorry, 0 button. So 0 button. Fix that, okay. And then the text will be a 0. And this, we can do, text is a decimal. And we will call this decimal button. Okay, that's great. That is really small and hard to read, so let's just bump that up a tiny bit here. Let's put that at what, 15? Maybe 20 to be safe. Yeah, there we go. Okay, and this is going to be equal sign, so let's minimize font here and just scroll and find that. So equals. Okay, and I guess we should bump that up a little bit to 15, sure. And of course rename it down here too, equal button. All right, and let's just keep doing this for every single one. So this will be minus button, font could be minus, and bump it up to 15 just like the other ones, the other symbols. This is going to be plus, so increase font, find the text, add the plus, scroll down here, call it plus button. Okay. This is going to be multiply, so multiply button, and that is usually an asterisk, or we can do a big X, that's usually pretty good. So there's that. Of course, just like the other ones, increase the font. That's absolutely enormous. Let's make it a lowercase x. See if that changes anything. Okay, so that looks a little better. And oops, messed that up. Not to worry, we can always fix that later. Let's just make this divide, so bump up font. Here we go. And the divide symbol is usually just a backslash, so that's pretty simple. And
obviously focus on the video for right now. What I'm getting ready to say you can go do here in a little bit, but if you want to use the actual division symbol, which is the line with the dot above it and the dot below it, you can go into the character map on Windows, just hit the Windows button and start typing the word character, and it allows you to pick all kinds of symbols that are not available on your keyboard. Back in the day, I believe it was the caret, which is on the 6, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was the percent sign. There was a percent sign on the keyboard at one point, at least I seem to remember there was. Maybe I'm wrong. But anyway, for now, just use the slash the way that he does.
And call it divide button. All right, very nice. And just for organization's sake, I know that this isn't normal to do, but I guess we'll make the equals button just like the size of the other ones and bring these down just so it's all nice and even. And we can extend the clear button to be 3 slots. So let's find the text for this. Call it I guess they usually call it AC, like auto clear. I think that means. Don't quote me on that. Call it clear button. Okay, and the font, just like the other ones, can be 15 as well. Sure, there we go. So for the numbers, I don't know if you're going to need to bump up the font or not, but let's try to do 15 just like the others, and let's just see how that looks. Okay, that looks pretty good. So we can do that for all of them, and I forgot to name this one, so just go back quick. And actually, this isn't a bad way of naming them. So we'll call this maybe num1. Sure. You can call it that. You guys can call it whatever you want, of course. If you hate the way that I am naming it, that is perfectly fine. You don't have to do what I do. But we'll just do this for now. Okay, bump this up to 15. And yes, I realize I guess I could have found out my design settings at first, like, have them all 15 size font and then copy them all down. But at this point, we're already kind of late in the process, so might as well just do it manually. It's not a big deal. So I'm just going to keep going here. And you guys probably don't want to watch this. You already get how this is working, so I'm just going to cut back in once I'm done with all these settings. Alright guys, we are back. So these numbers are all fixed. Just one more thing to do here. Let's bump this to 15. Okay. And it's at 0 and 0 button. So actually I was noticing that it's probably better to have a bigger equals button than a big 0 button. So we're going to just drag this stuff over and just extend the size of the 0 button, or the equals button, my bad. Okay, so we got a pretty decent sized numpad here. And let's just take this label down and do this. And then we're going to drag all of this up to this left corner. Okay, and resize the Windows form accordingly. Okay, and we're going to set it up in the back end so that even if they want to, they load in at the size, they can obviously size it to whatever they want, and the buttons will size accordingly based on what the user does. Alright, so all the backend stuff is going to be in the next tutorial. This first one was mainly for setting up the visual element.
Okay, so a couple of things. First of all, how neat is that you can just drag and drop elements into the window, right? That you don't have to like when we did the JavaScript calculator, we had to actually code the button from scratch, right? We actually had to say put a button here. Now there are what we call WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. WYSIWYG web editors that will allow you to drag and drop buttons and other elements into a web page like that. But typically that's not how you do it. You just write it by hand. So that's really cool. Now be aware that that's really only a feature that exists in Visual Studio. In VS Code, there definitely is no feature like that. There is a thing called Xamarin Studio, or I think it's Xamarin Studio. No. MonoDevelop, which is sort of like the open source version of Visual Studio, and it has drag and drop features, but it doesn't really. It's not really the same, and there's a lot of things that you can't do. For example, you can't do mobile app development with MonoDevelop and stuff like that. Additionally, Visual Studio for Mac, they claim is as fully featured as the Windows version, and has all the same drag and drop cool features that we just saw. It does, but again, it doesn't work as well. It's basically like a slightly updated version of MonoDevelop. That being said, just be aware that if you try to jump to a different operating system, you may not have your mileage may vary as far as what results you get. Something else about Visual Studio that's really, really cool, and I'm going to hop back over here real quick. Did you notice as he was dragging the elements around, for example, whenever he resized the field here, this black box, that when he drug it over, it gave him that blue line to show him that it was lined up with the other buttons? That's one thing. That's one area where the visual editor really excels, right? Is that you don't have to worry about like, okay, what was like the exact position? Oh, it's so many pixels off, and I have to like adjust it by. No, you just drag it, and I mean, if you've ever used like Photoshop or like any similar application like that, usually it will show you when you're lining up, when you're aligning with things and locking up with things and that sort of thing. So really cool feature. Um, Now, when he went through, and he mentioned this toward the end of the video, he mentioned that you would probably want to get one button that looks the way you want, so like it's the right font size and everything, and then copy that button repeatedly. But by the time he got to that, he was already basically done with the buttons. He's like, well, I'll just do it the old-fashioned long way. I actually really like that he makes that error because that shows because then like when he mentioned, he's like, man, if I just would have thought of that at the beginning, it would have saved me a whole lot of work. So just work smarter, not harder, right? That's always something that I'm a big fan of. And I mentioned Control C, Control V for copy and paste. That's pretty well universal for most applications if you didn't know that. Control X to cut, which removes it and copies it. And then Control V will paste it regardless of which of those two things you did previously. Control Z, undo. Very good, very good. So yeah, there's a whole multitude of them. But try to memorize them and try to make them a part of what you do. You Now obviously you're gonna have to use your mouse to like drag things around, but when you're coding, uh, especially if you're talking about like with text and things like that, you should never be touching the mouse. It should just be purely keyboard. That you're just doing keyboard shortcuts the entire time to move around, page up, page down, number key or arrow keys and different things like that, right?
So
Oh,
helpful.
it is, and honestly, like there are times that I find myself. I don't want to use the word impressed, but like almost being impressed by the level to which I'm using keyboard shortcuts. You know what I mean? Like sometimes I'll be in the middle of doing something and I'll realize I haven't touched the mouse in 10 minutes. Like I've just been sitting there doing stuff like with my hands on the keyboard the whole time. Um, and that's not a brag. I'm just saying like that's what you should aspire to. And I'm glad that I'm to that point with like basically all applications. Even if it's something new, once I learn the shortcuts, they just start to become second nature. It's like the process of learning and implementing keyboard shortcuts just becomes second nature to you eventually, as I'm sure you can attest to having used Photoshop and stuff for a while. All right, so let's hop over here into part 2 of the video. Hopefully that brief discussion we just had gave you enough time to get caught up if you were a little bit behind. As always, don't worry if you fall a little behind. You'll have at least a week to get it done. So don't worry and stress about that. So let's hop over here now and watch part 2 of this video series. It is also short like the previous one.
Alright guys, welcome back to another Codehaven video, and for part 2 of this tutorial on how to make a calculator app. So, picking up where we left off, let's first kind of fix this spacing here, and I noticed a lot of calculators actually have this 1 down by the 7. So yeah, let's just move some stuff around and make it look like a normal calculator. Alright guys, so now that that's fixed, let's make sure that we can maybe fix this spacing because it looks a little bit wider on the one side. So a cool trick I found is that when you're moving around, you'll notice these grid lines.
If you want, you can really quickly rearrange your buttons, or you can leave them the way they are, because if you think about it, it doesn't really matter what order your buttons are in, because they're like the 7 button is always going to be equal to 7 regardless of where it appears physically on the calculator. So don't worry about getting caught up on doing that.
They actually prevent you from getting the exact measurements that you want at times. So you could just click on a button and just tap the arrow keys and move it by 1 pixel at a time to exactly where you like it. So just like that, we have pretty much perfect spacing on these buttons, and we didn't have to use the grid lines. So let's just move this stuff over, and it looks like just about everything is perfectly spaced. We fixed the numbers down here, and now it looks like a normal calculator. So now let's get into the back end. Alright guys, so here's the back end. If you'll notice earlier, I had this stuff here by accident. So let me just remove this. And like I said earlier, you have to actually manually find the button that has that method activated and erase it there. And then you will be able to erase it from the back end. And let's quickly save our project. Okay, so in the back end, we have nothing but just the standard class that launches when you run your program. So let's get some functions for every single button that we have. So we're going to need a click button for, obviously, like when the user clicks it, this method will activate and we can do whatever we want inside of that. So let's just go through and do that for every button. And it's real nice and easy because you can just double click on each button and it will add it automatically. Just like that. And let's have this as a function and go through all the other buttons as well. The equals button and decimal. And I'm not sure if you aren't sure that you activated a button or not, you can always go click the lightning symbol and see. See, I do not have a click function here, so double click that. And the nice thing is when you're moving around to different buttons and stuff, it does keep this tab up and you can just see if you have it or not. So let's just make sure that we have every single click function for every single button. And so far it looks as if that's the case. Alrighty. Alright, good. So we don't need anything for this yet. We're just going to be changing the text property on it. And let's just save this and give it a run just so you guys can see what it looks like so far. So here it is. Obviously none of the buttons do anything, but the spacing is true, and the only downside is if you increase the size here, you'll just have all this white space. But we can learn how to change that later. And obviously if you make it smaller, then it actually erases some stuff, which isn't good at all. So we need to make sure to fix that stuff in the back end later. Alright, so in the back end here we got all these beautiful click functions, but they don't do anything. So first thing is we're going to have to declare some global variables here. So let's just set them up. We're going to need a string for the first set of numbers that somebody might enter. You know, like maybe they want to add 100 to 100. Well, we're going to need at least one, the first string to store that. So we'll just call it first. And we'll initialize it at nothing. And then we'll need another one. So string second equals blank. And of course, you guys can name it whatever you want. I don't necessarily just consider these the best names, but I'm just thinking on the fly here, so we'll just go with this. And we're also going to need a character to store what type of function they're using. So if they're dividing, multiplying, whatever it is, we're going to actually need a character to store that. So we're just going to call it char, initialize it like that. So I've seen a lot of people actually use a text box instead of a label for the user input. And I think what we're going to do instead is every single number is just going to respond to a keyboard command. So if somebody presses 1 on their numpad or 1 on the top left of their keyboard, then it'll press 1. And a lot of calculator apps do that, and I think that'd be nice to have. So we'll get to that later, but for now, we're also going to need a double to hold the result, and we'll just call it result, and we'll set it at 0. Okay, so I think we have most of the variables that we need. And for the next part, we're going to have to set up the label to respond to what button is clicked. All right, but before we do that, we're going to have to actually go down and just take care of something real easy here. So all these functions, divide, multiply, plus, minus. Let's just take care of that and set function to equal the divide symbol. So if this is clicked, we'll set that function to be divide, and then later we'll handle that with some if statements. So then we're going to have this function equals, we're going to do an asterisk because that's nice and easy to use. And then let's just copy this over because it's a lot faster. So let's do that. And for this, it's going to be plus, and for the other one, it'll be minus. Let's not forget about the equals button and the clear button, which we will also handle later. So let's copy this stuff over to here. And for the clear button, we'll just set it to C. And for the equal button, we will set it to equals. Alright guys, so I was looking over the code and I noticed that I'm pretty sure I'm going to actually need an input string. And that is because we actually need something to temporarily hold the first value and transfer it into this first variable, and then when they, then we can clear it. Then they'll enter in the second string, and then we can pass it off to here. So let's just add another string down here, and we will call it, we'll just call it user input, and we can initialize it at nothing. So now comes the easy part. Every time they click a button, obviously we need to reflect that number. So we need to display it on the label. And how we're going to do that is, let's just go and make sure we know the name of the label, which we called calculator display. So we're going to do calculator display dot text. We're going to set that equal to whatever the number is that we want. And actually it needs to be a plus equals, and it needs to be a string, because this is just text, and we can convert the string to an integer later, and we'll do it that way, or a double. So for each single one of these, we're going to do it like this, and we can just take this and copy it all the way down, and we will change it accordingly. Okay. Let's go back up here and fix every single one. So this is a 2, and a 3, and a 4. Oh, that's actually a 7. My bad. And an 8 and a 9. Okay, and then let's find 0, which is all the way at the bottom here. So this is 0. Now that's taken care of. We have all the numbers that we need, and let's move on to the next step. All right, guys, one more thing before this tutorial concludes is we also cannot forget about the decimal button. So let's just add that in here. That's going to be a dot, and it's not going to be a function. It's actually be calculator display text equals the decimal. And there we are. So we have all the basic functions lined out of what we're going to be doing here. And in the next tutorial, we'll add more functionality, and we will really start to turn this into a fully usable app. All right, guys, so that's going to be it for this video.
I'm sure the final thing is there, don't forget to like and subscribe, right? So pretty neat. Now, one way in which did one manner in which this kind of differed from the JavaScript version jump out to anybody? He said it right there at the end, and it really doesn't matter either way, which approach you take. But did anyone notice one big major difference? Any thoughts? It's what he said about the decimal right there at the end. Do you remember how in the JavaScript version it was a function? Not a function like a method, but like it was a function just like the plus and the divide, right? As opposed to being considered a number. He's taking a slightly different approach and treating it like it's one of the numbers. Am I saying that correct? Was that the case? Now that I'm saying that, I feel like I'm wrong. Does anyone remember? Was it considered a number? Because he ran a for each loop on both groups. But now I'm starting to second guess myself now that I say that. Honestly, does anybody remember? Because I don't. I feel like what I said was correct, but now I'm second guessing myself. Either way, you could consider it either a function or a number, if you will. Because if you think about it, it kind of... So one time I was having dinner with my wife and her grandparents and dad and sister, and somebody said something about negative numbers or something, and I said, isn't it interesting to think that, like, 0 is the only number in existence that is neither positive nor negative, right? Whether a number is positive or negative depends upon its relative position to 0, right? So 0 is sort of unique in that way. We have to have 0, otherwise you couldn't have numbers that went beyond 9, right? Or numbers if you really want to think about numbers, to go below 0 or below 1, because what would you put in front of the decimal, right? So people knew the decimal was there. A decimal is sort of the same way, though, right? That it's kind of a number, but it's also sort of a function. Like, it makes different things kind of happen. So you could really take either approach, right? They're both perfectly valid. It just depends entirely on how it kind of makes sense the most in your brain. That's something that Danny Crossing, the Danish guy that we watch a lot of his videos, that's something he says a lot, is sometimes there's more than one approach to something and more than one way to think of something, but you should go with the one that makes the most sense in your world, because ultimately that's all that really matters, right? Is if it makes sense to you. Because if it makes sense to everybody but you and you're the one trying to implement it, that's probably not the best way to be, right? Okay, so hopefully you've kept up-ish with what we've got so far. This is the final part of the series here, and we will finish the app up, and then you will actually, once this is done, you can actually compile it if you wanted and have your own little calculator app on your desktop. Now, I'm not just going to say, hey, good job, we're done, as I'm sure you have probably guessed. We're going to, I'm going to ask you to do the same thing with the JavaScript one. Change the font, change some colors, text sizes, that sort of thing. Okay, so let's hop over here and watch our final video. Then we'll have our discussion about what our big class project for the semester is going to be.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another Code Haven video, and the third part in this series of how to create a calculator app in C#. So the very first thing we're going to do today is just take care of a real simple step, which is making sure that we get rid of that 0 and any other random input right as we type in the first number. Obviously, when they type in, they just launched the app and there's just a 0 there, as you can see. Let's just launch it just to show you guys. So right now there's a 0, and if you click any button, it just keeps going. There's not really, it doesn't get rid of the 0. Now obviously it did because I just added this line, but before, or for any other number, it will not. And we gotta fix that. So right when they click these numbers, we need to make sure to clear out that input, and that's a pretty easy step. All we gotta do is just go down and add this to every single one. And let's not forget about 0. Okay, so the next part you're probably wondering is, wait a minute, if we erase the input, or at least the text, then how do we know what to add and what to subtract? Well, the good news is we actually have a user input variable to keep track of that. And this is also going to be a plus equals to just stack it up until they hit a plus or minus button or whatever it is. And it's obviously going to be dependent on what number they're clicking. So in this case, it will be a 1. And the other thing we need to change is this actually needs to be that. So right now, as it stands, if this is proper, resetting. So right now, as it stands, this should erase the input, set the user input variable to 1, and display this. So if we keep clicking 1, it should be endless ones, but there should never be a 0. So let's just give it a try. Okay, so 1, and like I said, it works, which is fantastic. So let's just quickly take care of this and go down the line and just make sure that all this is dependent resetting.
Okay, so go ahead and do that with all the, I'll give you just a minute here to go ahead and copy and paste all that if you want to. So that num1 there is calculator display.text equals the blank string, then user input plus equals 1, or whatever that number happens to be that you're working on at that time, and then calculator display.text plus equals user input. Now remember, it's not why whenever I click 1 a whole bunch of times, and I just kind of kill some time here while you're all getting caught up, but why when I click up 1 a whole bunch of times do I not end up with like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8? Why isn't it adding? Does anybody know? if you don't know, and I'm not trying to like criticize anybody, but if you don't know, this is one of those days where as soon as I tell you, you're gonna be like, oh right. Does anybody have any idea why? So look on line 20. I don't know if you can see. Line 20 is string user input equals an empty string. They're on line 20. Any idea why when I click one a whole bunch of times it doesn't add it? It just gives me a whole bunch of ones in a row. Well, what is it? What happens when you do plus equals on a string?
Oh, it adds.
It just adds that same string into it. It concatenates them, right? So plus equals, if that were an integer, it would increase its value by 1. So you would get 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, on into eternity, right? But that isn't what is occurring there. Because it's a string, because it's the visual representation of the number 1, not the numerical number 1, it just concatenates it all together. So if user input were equal to kitten, and I clicked that a bunch of times, I would get the word kitten concatenated to itself a whole bunch of different times, right? All right, let's move along.
So let's take care of this and just add these little lines to every single one, and I'll come back right resetting. So let's just take care of this little thing and resetting. So let's just take care of this little thing right here, resetting. I've successfully added these lines to every single number. So if we give it a quick launch, it should run as expected. So as we see here, it runs perfectly. The 0 is gone and the input is still tracked properly. Okay, so now let's take care of some of the functions. All right, so right now we have inside each function, for example, the plus button. Right now it just sets function to plus, but that doesn't really do anything. So inside each one of these, first we're gonna need to make sure that we hand off the current input to this first variable up here. So when they click plus, or whatever operator it is, the user input should be handed off to this first variable, and then it should be emptied, and then this function should be set to whatever one that the button was clicked. So, you know, the function would be plus if plus was clicked, and vice versa. So let's just go down here and take care of that. So first thing, like I said, this first variable is going to equal the user input, and that's it. And then we're going to empty out user input, and that should honestly be all we need to do for this, because later on we will take care of the function variable and what that does. So let's just quickly add that to each one of these, and I'll be right back. Alright guys, so let's just quickly take care of the clear button here. This actually doesn't need to be here. I was wrong about that. So what we're doing is just resetting every single variable. So function needs to be reset to nothing. The first variable needs to be reset to nothing, as well as the second. And then we have the user input string, and that is nothing as well. And there should be one more variable. Yes, the result is set back to 0, so that we can just reset everything. And also, let's not forget, just in case, let's erase what the calculator display says. And do that. Okay, great. And let's see what this little error is saying. Empty character literal. I don't think that's a big deal. There's not an actual line error, so it's just kind of complaining about that, but we'll see if it comes up later. Alright, so now that that's done, let's give it a quick run and just see if the clear button works. And it looks like it's actually going to complain about that. So let's X out and see how to fix this. Alright guys, so after digging around a little bit online and Stack Overflow, it looks like there actually isn't such a thing as an empty char. The closest you can get is actually a \0, but even that's not really necessary for us. So the good news is function is only used for if they have an equal sign or minus sign or whatever it is. But the good news is, like I said, every time you click one of those buttons, the function gets reset anyway, so that's good, and we don't need to worry about that. So right now we're resetting all these variables, which is great, and let's just save it and give it a quick run. Okay, so we have our app up, If we click, some gibberish and click clear, then it should be fine, which is great. And actually, let's just make the clear put the text back to 0. So let's just do that. Great. So now that every time that they decide to clear it, it goes back to 0, which is perfectly okay. And yeah, and like we added earlier, it still removes the 0 once you click it. Alright guys, so one of the things that we need to do is go down to the bottom and find the equals button, which is right here. Actually remove this, we do not need this. And we're going to add some simple if statements to it so that every time they click plus or minus, it'll depend what the function is. So first thing though, the second variable needs to equal user input when this button is clicked, because we know that the user is done entering stuff and we could set it to the second variable. So right after we get the second user input, we're going to need to parse the data. And to do that, we need to create 2 new doubles. So let's just create double first num and then second num. Okay, so now that we've created our variables, what we need to do is parse the data from the string. So to do that, you actually call the first variable that you want to set it to, which is first num. Then you set it equal to convert, and then there's a toDouble method, and then you have open parentheses, and inside here.
I just want to pause for a quick second to talk about that conversion thing. We've talked about converting things to strings before, especially in JavaScript. We talked about that quite a bit. We've also talked about the toInt32, which will convert it to an integer, right? In Python, it's just int. And then there's also float. You can convert to float as well. This is the first time we use the toDouble, but it's exactly the same as the other one. On line 131 there, he's using the word double, and then he did first num, comma, second num. All he's doing there, I know it looks like he's maybe creating like a weird function or something. What he's actually doing is just declaring 2 different variables that are of the same data type. Right, we don't have to do it all on one line. Since we don't have to give them initial values, we can just say double first num, comma, second num, semicolon. And it makes 2 doubles that are named first num and second num. All right, let's continue on.
Here we're going to just enter first because that's what we want to convert. We're converting a string to a double, and that should work perfectly just as long as there's nothing crazy in there, which isn't even possible. So that's good. And then let's just do the same thing for the second one. And instead of this, it's going to say second. So now that we have converted that data, let's move on to the next part. Okay guys, so the next part here, we're just going to have some simple if statements, and it's going to be based off what the function is currently set to. So let's just add some blank if statements and then some else ifs. So here we go. Else if.
If you were making this program on your own from scratch, excuse me, what might be a better approach than what he's doing right now? Any thoughts?
Case switch statements?
Yeah, I would probably use a case switch. Do you see how I'm becoming a convert as time is going on? How like even I am starting to see that, that like maybe the way that I've always kind of like seen it as being correct is really not. Do you remember what I said about if statements versus case statements? Do you remember what I said was kind of like my personal rule of thumb when it comes to them? Does anybody remember what I said?
More than 4 ifs?
Yeah. If there are more than 4 conditions you're testing for, 3 or 4, between 3 and 5, if there's more than one of those numbers, I would recommend going with case switch as opposed to, which are known as switch statements, as opposed to if, because in my mind at least, I imagine if this thing is true, else if it's this, else if it's this, and then here and else for my default, right? I feel like if you go beyond 2 or 3 else ifs, you probably would be better off with a switch statement. 1, it's cleaner to read, and 2, it just makes more logical sense, right? Because they're doing the same thing, it's just the way that a switch statement executes, particularly in this instance, is a little more efficient than a big old long list of if statements and else's is going to be.
And keep going down the line here. So we're going to need 4 in total because, you know, plus, minus, multiply, divide. And yeah, so then we're going to do the last else if here. And what I like to do is I always like to label it just so it's easier to find instead of looking inside the if. So for here, we'll do multiply, and this one will be divide, plus, and minus. And you guys don't have to do this. This is completely up to you. I just like to do that because it looks cleaner, and a lot of times I'll add notes to the end of the entire project. That way that anybody else looking at this in the future can easily look back at it and know what they're doing. Or even me, I could look back at my own code. Maybe it's been a while and I forgot about it, and I could just easily find my way around. So this is a good way of doing things. For this first if statement here, we're going to do if the function, which is our character that's keeping track of everything, if that equals plus, what we need to do is set the result double that we have at the very top. The result is going to equal number 1, or sorry, the first number plus the second number. Great. And then it's pretty simple for the next one as well. So we'll have function, and that's going to be equal to minus, and then the result is going to equal first num minus the second num. Great, and yeah, no errors there. So the third one here, this function is going to equal divide, which is this. And if we need to do that, so this is a little bit special, because remember, if you divide any number by 0, it's just nothing. And a lot of calculators just like to put a little statement in there. So what we're going to do is, if the number that they're dividing by, which should be the second number, of course. So if the second num is equal to, and let's add some brackets here. So if the second num is equal to 0, then we're going to complain. We're going to set the calculator text. Oops, not that. Calculator display.text.
So we know what he's doing right here, right? Which is that he's attempting to avoid what? What kind of issue is he trying to avoid right now? Not specific to programming, just in the real actual world. What is he trying to avoid happening? Something that can't be done, which is
Divide by 0?
absolutely right. Yes, very good. Divide by 0, right? Now, because as I just stated, that is not a programming specific thing. That is a thing that in the real mathematical universe does not exist. You cannot divide by, well, I mean, I guess you could, but nothing happens. It's not like a thing that can be, right? So you can't divide by 0. So since we know that's an existing error that can crop up in places other than calculator apps, right? Like if you're trying to figure out like a score or like, you know, damage done or something like that, like in an RPG, you could potentially have an issue where it's attempting to divide by 0, and you don't want to try to do that, right? Because depending on the context, it could crash the app or your computer. What might be a better way than what it is he's getting ready to do, which is just he's going to change the calculator's text to say like, hey, you can't do that or something. Any thoughts? We saw how to do this, how to handle, being the key word there, this sort of thing last week. Does anybody remember?
Didn't you say it was like a try and catch?
Yes, try catch. Very good. So it will basically, how a try catch works, and a simple explanation for the context here, a try catch would be like, hey, if they attempt to divide by 0, like test for that, and if that happens, catch it and say, hey, you can't divide by 0. Like, and I say that to say, not that you cannot use his approach. His approach works just fine. There's a number of ways you can approach it. But because divide by 0 is an existing error or exception, and it already has built-in built-in syntax and things to handle that kind of stuff. That's how I would personally go with it, right? If it's going to do some heavy lifting for you, if it's already like planning to do that, go ahead and let it. There's no reason to say, no, don't worry about it. No, let it do its thing, and so you don't even have to think about it, worry about it, right?
I'm going to set that equal to, let's just have a funny message in there. It'll be like, LOL, no. You can either can set it to whatever you want. I'm just doing that just because. And then have an else. And then if we don't have it set to 0, then all we need to do is simply just compute the result. So that's going to be the first number divided by the second number. Great. And then, of course, we need to display that accordingly. But let's just take care of multiply real quick. So if the function is equal to this little asterisk here, then the result is going to be the first number times the second number. And there we are. So now, not only do we have to compute what the answer is going to be, but with the equal button, we also have to make sure to update the display accordingly. So the best way to do this is to convert this result back to a string and then display it. So we'll just call the calculator display.text, and that's going to be equal to the result to string. And then we need parentheses here. So let's just add this to every single line that it needs to be. So this is great because we don't really need to do anything special in there. And then here we do need to display the text properly, and here as well. So now that all these functions are done, let's just go check and see if it's working right. All right, so let's try something simple like 2 plus 2. Great, it's 4. And the clear button should work. Awesome. And let's just add all this random stuff. So that plus, I don't know, 541. Okay, great. The only thing I'm seeing here is that it does not go back to a 0 once we have clicked clear. So let's just make sure that that's working still. So clear button, yeah, this has got to be a 0. That way that it just looks better. So let's start it up again. So let's say they add 2 plus 2. Now they're done. Click 0 or click clear. Now it's back to 0. Great. All right, guys, that's going to conclude it for this 3-part series. One thing I want to address is that I did talk about something about resizing in the other video. However, I did quickly discover with a little bit of research that that's actually going to take a lot more work to scale each one of these buttons up accordingly and this label here. So that's really going to be an entirely different tutorial. If you want me to do that, please drop a comment down below.
Okay, and I'm very glad that you mentioned that at the end, because yeah, that is one downside with I'm totally losing. It has left my head. I cannot remember what in the world it's called. This is WinForms. WPF Forms is the other one, which is Windows Presentation Foundation. I think is what that's, yes, pretty sure that's what it stands for. Anyway, I wanted to show you this first because the quickest, easiest, fastest way to do it. It's literally just like drag and drop, put it where you want it, da-da-da, right? But the problem, as he illustrated, is if you resize that window, it's all funky, right? The buttons don't resize automatically. It doesn't like tie to a specific aspect ratio and that kind of stuff. WPF forms are intended to sort of fix that problem. They use a grid system. They use similar to, looks a lot like HTML, honestly. Like if you look, it's called XAML, and if you actually look at it, it looks basically like HTML. It's got grid and different columns and things like that. So you can do a layout in a very specific way that scales. So instead of saying like, you know, the buttons and the screen are this specific size, you say that it's a specific ratio. You know, it's going to take up 3 columns it's going to take up 3 of the 4 columns, or like, you know, 2 of the 3 columns, or whatever it's going to be, right? So that's fine for now. Like, it doesn't need to scale, right? I think we'd all agree it's fine the way that it is. Now, here is what I would like you to do for this project. So I would say the majority of you have at least a little tiny bit of it done, having hopefully followed along a little with the tutorials as we were going. But first of all, do some changes of font styles, colors, sizes, that sort of thing. Kind of play around with it visually. But also go in and improve the code a little bit. Maybe do that try-catch, right, for the divide by zero error. Maybe go in and do a switch statement instead of the if statements, right? Now, the if is fine when it comes to, well, I mean, you're making it a try-catch, I guess. But if you chose not to do that, if you wanted to leave it as just that if statement, so that you can't divide by zero, if is fine in that instance, because you're literally testing for one condition, right? That would be totally fine. But for the actual, like what the functions are, so you know if it's going to add or multiply or whatever, try making that a switch statement. Get some practice doing that, okay? Any questions, concerns, comments, thoughts, or ideas? No? Okay. So before I send you on break, let's have that very brief discussion that I mentioned about what we think we might like to do as a class for a semester project. I'm not saying we can't do a game, by the way, but if you do want to do a game, you need to keep it really simple because since, especially for those of you that are in the Friday class, you already have one game on your plate. There's no reason to add a second one. Any thoughts? Still, it's not absolutely crucial to come up with it today, but we probably need to in the next couple of days get it figured out. Okay. Just be thinking about that then. All right, so go ahead and come back at 10 o'clock, and we will start working on getting this project modified.